Hello, and welcome to the 12th episode of our Fundamental Principles of Communist Production and Distribution by the Group of International Communists Reading Group series. Today is Friday, the 31st of December 2021, and I'm your host, Tom O'Brien. Today we read Chapter 12, The Abolition of the Market. Apologies for not releasing an episode for the last 2 weeks, but unfortunately I've been Omicroned. I fear that I might now be suffering from long COVID, so hopefully that doesn't drag on too long. I've had to cancel 4 interviews in the last couple of weeks while I've been recovering, so hopefully I get a chance to record these over the next couple of weeks and release them in due course. This week I have the new monthly subscriber Beyond Meritocracy and the new annual subscribers Larry McNeely and Adam Bilby to thank. If you'd like to help out the show, please head on over to the Patreon and throw me a few commie dollars. It really does help to keep these episodes flowing. Okay, let's join the discussion. Welcome to the 12th session of our Fundamental Principles of Communist Production and Distribution Reading Group series. Today we're on to Chapter 12, The Abolition of the Market. Just when we thought we were finished throwing shade on various other communist/anarchist movements, we're back to hitting the Bolsheviks a bit about the market. Okay, so can I get somebody to throw their hand up who wants to read this first section? There we go, Will.
All right. Well, the abolition of the market. A. With the Bolsheviks, the Supreme Economic Council distributes the product of society. The Russian Revolution has not only shown us that production without a unit of accounting is a childish fiction of naive fantasists, but has also given us lively enlightenment about the mysterious, much-discussed question of the abolition of the market. This has always been a very difficult topic. Yes, Marx was an easy talker. He could say that under communism the market would be abolished, but how would operational units get their means of production and raw materials if they could no longer obtain them on the market? And how would the workers get their food if the market did not act as a mediator between producers and consumers? The Bolsheviks are trying to solve the problem by implementing the general cartel of Hillfording. The entire production and distribution would function without money, without a market, and without product prices as one huge monster enterprise. The development of the dissolution of the market was very fast because the value of the ruble fell so fast that the prices of goods rose by the hour. Soon, almost nothing was available for money, so that the entire food supply was almost completely in the hands of the state. Zinoviev writes about this, quote, "If the value of money is falling in Russia, it is certainly very difficult for us to bear. But we have a way out, a hope. We're heading for the complete abolition of money. We are naturalizing wages. We are introducing free use of trams. We have free schooling, free lunch, and even, if for the time being poor, free housing, lighting, etc. We are doing this very slowly in extremely difficult circumstances. We have to fight all the time, but we have a way out, a hope, a plan." End quote. In fact, all economic life in the cities was regulated in this way. The farmers were excluded. So that the Commissariat of Food Supply, the Narkomprod, served 38 million people. Considering that telephone, water supply, gas, electricity, rent, transport, and fuel were provided free of charge, it is fair to say that the market in the cities was abolished. It would therefore appear that we have an excellent basis here for an investigation into the question of the abolition of the market. However, this is only the case to a very limited extent, as this socialization of distribution had to be carried out under very unfavorable conditions. Russia was shaken by civil wars, which meant that the production system had to be largely geared towards war production, and a significant proportion of industrial workers were taken out of production. As a result, farmers could not be supplied with industrial products at all, so they had to supply their grain without receiving anything in return. Under these circumstances, it is obvious that the farmers refused to farm their land so that there was less and less to distribute. We are giving this information to show that the Russian idea of market abolition had very poor chances of being realized. The fiasco which the concept finally suffered could therefore be explained by the supporters of this position from the circumstances. An assessment of the possibility of such a system would only be possible where it could be fully implemented. We would, therefore, only be able to examine the problems of abolishing the market in Russia in practice if we were able to supply farmers with all kinds of products after all. Unfortunately, this was not the case. And so the only result is that we have a clear idea of what the Russians mean by abolishing the market. This in itself, however, is very important. The Russian view is as follows. The Bolsheviks wanted to replace the market with production and consumption statistics. The Supreme Economic Council, in conjunction with Narkomprod, would statistically determine the quantities of bread, sugar, meat, textiles, etc., needed to meet the needs of the population. Accordingly, the Supreme Economic Council would then issue production orders to the operational units. The Supreme Economic Council had an overview of the needs, knew the productive forces, and would now set up production to meet the needs of the people. The prerequisite for such production control was that the management and direction of the entire operational life were concentrated in the hands of the Supreme Economic Council. As far as we have done so far, the investigation does not give rise to any new assessments. It is the realization of an old theory that we have already encountered in the discussion of Sebastian Faur's libertarian communism. However, the practice has already shown that in such a system, there can be no production calculation in reality, so that no planned production can take place.
This is kind of reverting back somewhat to some of the stuff that we've hit earlier in some of the earlier chapters, really here about the way they were going for the Hillfording approach. There's nothing particularly new here that jumps out to me. Does anybody have anything to say on this bit? It seems somewhat of a rehash of previous points, but with some new information, a few statistics and a few quotes. Well, it's kind of impressive that they served. The life in the cities was regulated in this way, so that the Commissariat of Food Supply served 38 million people. You know, that's a hell of an amount of people to take out of the market for food. And also saying that telephone, water supply, gas, electricity, rent, transport, and fuel were provided free of charge. That's a hell of a lot of the composition of people's, say, wages today. Like if you took out gas, electricity, rent, transport, water supply, telephone, and food, there's not that much left, which kind of makes me wonder a little bit towards getting what we were talking about last week. I think it might have been you, Will, that made this point that there's not that much factor of individual consumption kind of left if we were to do a similar thing like under the system as proposed here. Yeah,
there's not much else remaining, and so it's just a question of do we want to socialize those things, and like how quickly, is it acceptable to not fully have freely take food, as an example.
Yeah, like see, maybe there's like you see with the stuff, some of them like rent would be gone. There wouldn't be a rent, but I would say there's probably in all of those sections there, like in most countries now, especially since neoliberalism, like telephone, water supply, gas, electricity, there are probably large rents that people are paying there. I know the composition in America for some of these, as a percentage of people's pay is a lot higher than other countries. So there might actually be still quite a lot of disposable income. So I can imagine there could be 40, 50% disposable income after you take these out in a communist society when you get rid of all these various rents. But it's still something, it's still a very interesting point. Jitsi, I think that's Herman.
Yes, I think this was a little bit the point we discussed in the previous chapter. It was in the chapter 11, section 8, the growth process of communism. And there I said that I feel it is a little bit a contradiction what they wrote there, because here they say that the practice has already shown that in such a system there can be no production calculation in reality. And this is exactly what they described a little bit in the growth process of communism. So therefore, I think this is really a point to consider, that there is a big risk in socializing so much of the consumption. Yes, the working time calculation is always a necessary measure the people need in order to rationalize their needs in respect to the work which belongs to it.
Would they not still be doing the labour time calculation though, even if these are in the GSW units? So it would be possible to have a rational calculation.
Yes, but I think then they must decide. So if they continue with the working time calculation, of course they can say this is just an information. But if you take the information seriously, then you keep to this information. And if people don't do this, then you remind them that there is a rationality behind this information and they cannot just do what they want. So therefore, I think it's not just taking free for your need, and in addition, you have this calculation. So I think either the calculation says something what is relevant or not.
Okay, Will has his hand up.
Yeah, so it seems like they're making a couple points about the kind of socialization that took place in the early USSR. First, that they're starting off with a bad model, right? They're modeling everything on the general cartel model. Then the second thing is that, like, due to the circumstances of the revolution, they're not actually exchanging anything with the peasants, right? Part of the whole merit of this labor time calculation is everyone gets back exactly what they receive, right? The peasants are getting nothing because it's a war and they didn't have implements to give them, but they still needed their food. It's unclear that they're like Herman said, like based on the previous chapter, it's unclear that they're actually arguing against these kinds of socializations. They actually sound kind of impressed by them, you know? And so then it's a question of, you know, is it just because they had a bad model and bad contingencies? Or is it like we really need to go much slower here and have a kind of, you know, worker starve setup?
What was the last thing you said there? Worker what setup?
Oh, worker starve, you know, like, you know, if you do not put in the work and you haven't been allotted claims on the social product, that's the rule. Everyone follows the rule. They get what they give, right? That's the alternative, right?
Yeah, but I can imagine that I can imagine an equivalent of a UBI being paid out of. So this is all this for me largely falls into policy. You know what I mean?
Right? Yeah, that's the discretion of the producers, right? They have to, it's only by their leave that others get to eat.
Yeah, like I think, well, it's an interesting point, but like we would assume that non-producers also have a vote. You know, like pensioners or whatever would have a vote, or, you know, different people that aren't, you know, I think we would assume that everybody would have a vote, but it seems to me more like it falls into the realm of policy. You know, what do we put into GSW? You could say, you know, a minimum, everybody gets a minimum standard of, everybody gets rent free, and everybody gets a minimum basket of, you know, pot of rice every week, bag of rice if they need it. You're not going to let them starve, but if people want to have, you know, good levels of consumption, they got to, you know, pull their finger out. I can imagine it'll go. I would imagine that would be something that would typically become a kind of common norm. The other thing is that if it's in a revolutionary period, you know, where you have, you know, essentially a class war, I can imagine at that stage, like it could absolutely be if you don't work, you don't get food. So, you know, I can imagine this would be not just a policy issue, but also like, you know, a class war issue, certainly in the earlier stages. Okay, it would be good to move on to B. Randy.
The Supreme Economic Council distributes the labor power. However, this practical experience may not be of convincing importance for the workers. Therefore, we will now let the practice speak from a completely different perspective. The practice has already shown that the producers in the system are nothing other than the toy of those who dispose of the means of production and the social product. The Supreme Economic Council is responsible for the distribution of the national income. It decides which part of the product is intended for the consumer, how much is used to expand the production apparatus, and with which part it strengthens its dominant position in the state apparatus. Therefore, If it may not yet be convincing to the workers that such production is impossible, the political significance is much more important. In the ever-increasing concentration of the production apparatus in the hands of the state, we see the forms in which the dictator of the proletariat passes into the dictatorship over the proletariat. This is the political lesson we must learn from the Russian abolition of the market, and it is urgently needed. For among the revolutionary workers, we still find the widespread opinion that the first years of the Russian Revolution showed a development towards communism, but that with the induction of the NEP, with the reintroduction of the market, it was diverted into capitalist channels. Our research shows that this view is wrong. The development of the first years was a development towards ever-increasing enslavement of the working class, enslavement that kept pace with the concentration of the productive forces with the growth of communism. Every further step towards the supply in natural produce meant a greater dependence on the central apparatus. In the end, the situation was such that the production managers had a huge army of slaves at their disposal, and they determined how much product they would allocate to this army as wages. Perhaps many readers will find this formulation exaggerated, but this is by no means the case. We will prove it. This enslavement did not come about because Lenin, Trotsky, etc. were so obsessed with power, but because there was no other way. If the management and control of the huge production apparatus are in the hands of a supreme economic council, then they must have access to the human material. The practice of the Russian Revolution proved this. We now want to show how, in this system, all individual freedom has ceased and everyone only has to follow the instructions of the production managers. Trotsky usually does not mince his words, and so he explains. If we are to speak seriously of a planned economy, if labor is to be distributed in accordance with the economic plan at the given stage of development, the working class must not lead a nomadic life. It must be moved, distributed, and detached, just like the soldiers. The Central Committee for the General Labor Duty, therefore, decided in December 1919 under the chairmanship of Trotsky that the skilled worker leaving the army, with the workbook in hand, is the name of the country's production plan, must go where his presence is required. Besides, the Committee on Labor Day decided that workers could be forced to give up their homework in order to work in the state-owned enterprises, while it could likewise command that the transfer of labor from one operational unit to another can be carried out in accordance with the production plan, as above. For the introduction of the production plan, the workers were therefore simply sent to work, while they were often forced to work without any remuneration. This was particularly true in the case of logging, where the farmers were forced to cut down the wood from the forests free of remuneration under the point of the bayonet. Serfdom was reintroduced under communism. No wonder that the workers did not feel too much for this kind of communism. Thus, Trotsky complained that the hundreds of thousands of workers deserted. He says, "In the major industries, we have 1,150,000 workers, but in reality, only 850,000 workers. What happened to the 300,000? They have left. Where did they go? In the village, maybe, to other industries. Maybe they are engaged in speculation." We conclude that the practice has already decided that the abolition of the market through a centralized order of production and distribution also means a centralized orientation of the human material, which, like soldiers, must be transported, distributed, and detached. This also raises the question of whether this is really the abolition of the market in the communist sense. Before we take a closer look at this, let us take a closer look at the Bolshevik view, even if it can't be done on the basis of the practice.
Wow, there's quite a lot in there. Okay, I find this stuff very interesting. I just like the historical quotes. I love reading this stuff. I think it's really interesting. So let's try this one. In the ever-increasing concentration of the production apparatus in the hands of the state, we see the forms in which the dictatorship of the proletariat passes into the dictatorship over the proletariat. And he makes the kind of case as well here that, like, you know, the situation that ended up is that you have this massive, basically an army of slaves, he says here, or they say here, at the whim of the production managers and the Supreme Economic Council. But he makes a kind of a materialist case here. He says this enslavement did not come about because Lenin, Trotsky, etc. were so obsessed with power, but because there was no other way. You know, I think there might be some kind of, you know, I think that might be giving Lenin and Trotsky and some of these guys a little way out. You know, we see early on, I think in chapter 2, how the SPD, once Engels had died, essentially went towards a Hillfording approach pretty quickly. They changed their policies. And, you know, Lenin and Trotsky and these guys I would have to think were kind of aware of these debates. So they kind of went in for this kind of top-down bureaucratic approach. The fact that it ended up so bad maybe have surprised some of them, but they did go for it. So I think there's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B there. What do people think? Am I being too harsh on Lenin and Trotsky, or am I being too easy on them? Will?
As far as I understand, like from this book and other areas, like these ideas were kind of the mainstream Marxist ideas of the Second International. And, these people, the GIC, had represented the kind of left wing of those debates. So yeah, they kind of picked the mainstream view, which, they're critiquing and saying is wrong. But also it's like, it was the mainstream view. It was what everyone believed. And also there's just kind of like a political point. It's a lot easier to make this point of being like, what could they have done? And, so that you don't have to be as critical of them in the revolution. If you're trying to win people over to your cause, show a different way forward without having to attack the beloved leaders of before.
I'd like to know like how much of the debates on these type of economic issues were about at the time, and how aware some of the big leaders were. That's just an interesting kind of a historical one. But certainly, like, there is no other way that things could have happened once you have this idea of the Supreme Economic Council pushing and demanding people around. I do think like there's a whole lot of quotes. I remember doing a review of a paper by a Korean Marxist called, I think I'll destroy his name, but Zhou Jingzhang. We did with the General Intellect Unit, and there was a whole load of quotes about this kind of stuff, about how the workers are army, they have to do what they're told. The skilled worker leaving the army with the workbook in hand in the name of the country's production plan must go where his presence required. It's just chock a block of quotes like that. It's kind of incredible here. If they're looking at, they thought in the major industries they had 1.2 million workers essentially, and like nearly probably just over a quarter, nearly just shy of a third of the workers, had legged it. They probably just went, these conditions are so rough, so crap. Like, what is this communism or socialism if we just got like people bossing us around and treating us like shit and making us work long hours? Might as well go back to the village. And that's an incredible lack of productive output. Like, imagine what would happen in the morning to the US economy if like, what would the equivalent now be? What if like 30 million workers just decided, fuck this, I'm going to do a homestead and I'm going to go home and grow some tomatoes? It would just be pure savage. Kielce.
I wonder how much of that can be related to their own lived experience and that wouldn't apply today in the same way. So we could be talking here about workers who have villages to go back to, whereas that's not the case in modern America. And where, given the choice under any circumstances, of there not being a landlord or a local warlord, kicking them out and threatening them, that people would choose to go back to the village because they just prefer that sort of life compared to the sort of miserable conditions you might expect to see in cities.
Yeah, like definitely not making the case that it could happen today, but it's just like trying to get across the case. Like, imagine if it were to happen, like what would it mean for the economy? I think Randy put up his hand.
Yeah, I was thinking it seems a lot, especially I'm on the West Coast over here, and it seems like this kind of explains the homeless crisis in a lot of ways of, them wanting to form communities and then prioritizing that over being a part of the labor force. Like it's a pretty huge deal.
Can you expand on that a bit? Like, what do you mean? Like that the homeless people themselves prefer to have a homeless community than to work?
Well, I think it's a combination of, some people not being able to contribute in a way that they can like sustain themselves, especially in areas with high rent and stuff. Plus, there's kind of how it happens in America is there's a lot of migration of the homeless from all over America to the coasts because a lot of the central states just criminalize it. So it's kind of like so I'm kind of thinking in this example, like the 300,000 are the people going from all over the US who don't really want to participate in the labor force because of the, shitty conditions and the lack of hope and all of those sort of things. And then going to the West Coast. And then because there's not really like the ability to go back to the village, and the closest thing to that of living in a village and kind of a communal lifestyle is, either communes or a lot of the kind of homeless communities that have been set up over here with a lot of mutual aid networks and the like.
Will, I think, had his hand up.
Oh, yeah. No, it just reminds me of kind of the fall of Rome, or, the fall of maybe the Republic. Early, like they get too good at conquering and being an empire, so they import all these slaves, and then, they displace all of their laborers from the fields who are like form the backbone of their army and stuff. And then they have a huge surplus population in the city, and then they have all this political conflict over the bread dole, right? And then eventually, there's violence, and eventually Caesar takes power. So, I think it's a symptom of the decaying empire.
Yes, the decaying empire. I love to see it. Okay.
So
Slavic.
Yeah. So I've definitely seen a number of quotes from Trotsky, definitely numerous ones treating workers as soldiers. And I also think there's a lot of time the inspiration of Fordism coming into that as well, which lines up with what they're saying. And, whether they're, you see Lenin or Trotsky as power hungry people or not, like for this sort of implementation, they become kind of the ideal figures to run that sort of system because they have those views of treating the workers like soldiers and in this sort of manner. So whether it's their, subjective opinion or not, like they kind of become the ideal leaders for that kind of implementation. And the kind of question I had is like earlier, they kind of talked about the avoiding, like sidestepping the question of centralization versus decentralization. But like in this section where it talks about the Supreme Economic Council, it almost sounds like in that context, like centralization and concentration essentially become the same. And I'm wondering, like, what is the difference between that concentration and centralization then?
I don't know. Like when you say concentration, you mean concentration of what?
Well, they were talking about the concentration, the right of disposal over all the labor, basically, to decide, whether they're going to feed those resources back into strengthening their own position, how much of it is going to go to income for workers. So they basically have all the decision-making power. But I guess I see that like centralization and concentration just sound like the same thing. And I'm not sure if I'm like not picking up on the nuance, because earlier in the book, they were talking about we're going to sidestep the question of centralization versus decentralization that anarchists and Leninists often fight about.
Anybody have any thoughts on that? Chris?
Yeah, I wanted to just say that I think that just describes a class society. If you have a center that has control over the surplus and how it's disposed of and how it's allotted, then that's a class society. There's no way around it. And that's what this USSR was. What kind of class society it was, you can debate, but I think it's incontestable. When you have people enslaved in the taiga, chopping wood at bayonet point. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Herman?
Yes, I think their point here is that when there is no direct relation between the producer and the product based on the working time calculation, then you get a concentration of the production apparatus in the hand of committees or the state. And this is really the difference. And this is the criticism of the Bolsheviks' idea to run this like a general cartel, economy in kind.
Do you think there is a difference between centralization and concentration then? Or is it just hand in glove with each other?
No, there's a difference, because concentration, they mean concentration as a power. So some committee or state decides. So if there's a direct relation between producer and product based on the working time calculation, it's not really relevant if you organize certain things centralized or decentralized with this system, because this is something completely different than the central administration versus a direct relation between product and producer.
Okay, thanks for that, Herman. Okay, are we going to move on then? See, the consumption statistics. Who wants to raise their hand there and do a bit of reading? Alan.
C, the consumption statistics. The real intention of the Bolsheviks, as we know, was to produce for the needs of the workers. Now that is easier said than done. For how will the Supreme Economic Council learn about the needs of the workers? What is its measure of need? Surely it can more or less determine how much bread, meat, etc. is needed by all workers together. So it's relatively easy to produce production and consumption statistics for these matters. However, this has its shortcomings because it's very complicated to consider the shades of needs in statistics. This makes it even more difficult to go beyond the uniform bread, uniform clothes, and uniform sausage. The objections become even more serious, however, if we look at the products that are not used by everyone, but which are due to the special nature of different people. How great is the demand for these goods? Surely the statistician can try, but that is precisely not to gear production to the needs of the people. And last but not least, there's the major objection that if you produce according to statistics, you make economic life freeze. If operational units have produced according to consumption statistics, it is very likely that demand has already changed again, and therefore the apparatus is not geared to demand. The thing is, therefore, that it is not possible to squeeze the flow of life into the formulas of the consumption statistics, and it therefore makes no sense to want to determine the demand statistically. Statistics do not go beyond the very general. They cannot grasp the particular. We can, therefore, say that production according to consumption statistics is by no means production according to needs, but rather production according to certain standards, which for us are determined by the central management body of operational life. But as we have already said, this is an academic question. After all, we are not interested in whether production based on statistics is possible or not. In any case, it can only be carried out if there is a central power of disposal over the human material, and we do not want that.
Okay, so this makes a couple of, kind of a very simple point about how, it's easy to come up with statistics for, tons of sugar, tons of concrete, right? But then when it gets down to like smaller objects, like how many of these types of new felt tip pens or, these type of corduroy trousers, things that fluctuate with taste, new products coming on the scene, people experimenting. Like, how do you decide how many, like, say, things that are of a particular taste to certain people, we should be producing? I think it's just it's very. I think it becomes very difficult because it's not a steady flow. Like I used to work in doing data analytics for a crowd that like a big chain of equivalent to Walmart in the UK, with literally million of SKUs. So that's like the identifier and codes for the different products. And like you would have very regular consumption patterns for certain things, but other things actually would be all over the place. A new product would come in and become extremely unpopular, and you cannot predict that from 12 months ago what's going to happen to frozen yogurt. So this idea that you could have a statistician, you could have a central statistics body decide all these small items, to me it's not even nearly logically possible. Randy had his hand up.
Yeah, one thing I guess I'm not very informed about, so I'm curious. How did it end up getting decided in the USSR? Like, was it just the central body would generally allocate themselves the most favorable or stylish items, essentially? I feel like that's like the American view of it, but I don't know how accurate to the truth that is.
I'm not that sure. I remember hearing somewhere that what would happen a lot of times is that, a certain type of blouse or shoe was made and people would really like it. And so that what the planners would say, they get there'd be big desire for this. And then they'd say, oh God, people really want these. And they'd produce a big glut of them. And then no one wanted them because everybody had them. There's loads of kind of quasi-market type stuff going on there. But I really don't know when it came down. I think it was pretty decentralized at the very lowest level of production. Does anybody know? I know there was big material balances for large scale important items. Slavic.
Yeah, my understanding is that the general emphasis was towards heavy industry, which is why you had these large black markets for things that are for individual consumption. In the later years, there's this whole thing with like everybody wanting like American blue jeans, and the only way you can get them is through black market. So I think in general, the decision was like, okay, we're going to focus really hard on raw industries and military, things like that, and then just kind of leave the individual consumption behind for a while. At least that's how the emphasis changed. So, and then you kind of got those needs met through like black market routes. So by that I mean like they just completely, I think, de-emphasized like, oh, well, it's not seen as a need as much. We got to put everything to catch up with the West, right?
But I do think they didn't have like material balances for small consumption items, because they did have like, but by the end, I think they were, God, I'm trying to remember the statistics, but I think it was in the couple of million like individual items that they were producing, but they weren't planning all of those. Chris.
Yeah, I'd like to know more about material balances for just everyday consumer items. But one thing that I find shocking is, like, bearing in mind, most of the industry was destroyed. They weren't producing at a pre-World War I level even. It's something like 80% of production was down in, a lot of heavy industries. But still, there are simple things that they could have tried to produce for, say, that farmers would want, who are already producing at a pretty primitive level. Iron plows and very simple things, pots and pans, things that they would actually could use and would improve their lives in a very direct way. If they had some input into what they could actually give the farmers in return that didn't require a lot of resources to produce, not like tractors or anything, it might have solved a lot of these issues. But it doesn't appear that they had any interest, or at least any means of figuring that out, at least the way they were doing it. But I could be wrong there, but that's just how it seems to me.
I think as well, if you wanted to industrialize, you wanted to maximize the rate of exploitation of the peasants as well. So I think there's a lot of that going on. Get them to work 5 extra hours and then give them a pot.
I mean, how much can they do? Like it's determined by it's a short growing season in Russia. There's only so much rye you can, or wheat or whatever you can harvest. It's like you throwing people at it and having them work extra long with the same implements. Don't know how it could increase yields, but yeah, it's
well, you could probably bring more you could bring more land into use. There's always kind of marginal land.
Yeah, that could be one way. Yeah.
Herman.
Yes, I think the most important part in this section C is in the last 2 sentences. So they write more or less that if you can produce according to statistics or not is for them an academic question. They are not really in this book interested in this academic question. They took it just up for an example. So in any case, they say that this is then carried out by a central power. And this is really their point in the book, that if you can produce according to statistics or not, or how successful this is really beside the point, because there is still wage labor connected with this kind of organization of the economy. And this is what they, from a worker's point of view, say at the end, the last sentence: we don't want that.
Yeah, no, very good point. Very good point. Yeah, I kind of skipped over that. Okay, D. Alan, do you want to take D then?
D, with the bourgeois economists, the market as a measure of needs. For the bourgeois critics of communism, the abolition of the market is the central point of their struggle and also their strongest weapon. It is no coincidence that this is their strongest weapon. In the struggle against communism, they can only oppose the hitherto prevailing conception of communism, which is nothing other than the replacement of the market by a statistical apparatus. The critics rightly point out that these are hollow phrases that conceal the lack of clear concepts. The bourgeois critics all agree that the market, despite all its negative aspects, is in any case a measure of needs. The market playfully solves the question of adapting the production apparatus to needs. The market mechanism ensures that a change in requirements is immediately transferred to the production system without the use of statistics. When demand for a product increases, the demand on the market increases, prices rise, and the capitalists expand the production for this item. When the demand for a particular product decreases, the market immediately reduces production to match the reduced demand. From their point of view, the market mechanism can very well do what the consumption statistics cannot do. Therefore, they declare communism to be impossible as long as it cannot be specified what is to replace this mechanism. The economist H. Block formulates this as follows, quote, "If the individual exchange is abolished, the production is necessarily social, so the products are necessarily social as well. Marx did not continue to rack his brains over the methods of achieving and determining social necessity. As long as it cannot be shown how the market mechanism is to be replaced, an economic calculation in the common economy, i.e. rational socialism, is unthinkable." Before we deal with this topic, we must consider the difference in character between capitalist and communist distribution. It is true that the market is an indicator of needs, but only in the capitalist sense. The thing is that labor power is a commodity that can be bought on the market, while the price is about the minimum subsistence level. The national product can grow immensely, but the worker receives no more than the quantity determined by the value of his labor power. Without a doubt, his needs are much greater. They are just awakened by the great mass of product that is unattainable for him. Let capitalism, with a beautiful gesture, point to its market mechanism, which is supposed to be an indicator of need. In reality, it does not know needs, or even less so than those who want to replace the market with a statistical apparatus. It is not even necessary for capitalism to know needs, precisely because it does not create for needs, but profit. Capitalism works best, and it is healthiest, when real big profits are made. That is, when the workers are given as little as possible. For the proletariat, the whole splendid market mechanism moves only within the narrow limits that capitalist profit production leaves to the commodity labor power. At the same time, there is no question of knowing needs in the communist sense.
Okay, so this is an interesting section where he's dealing with the kind of attacks against the replacement of the market with statistics by the bourgeois economists. They talk about, how the market actually manages to manage production, increasing and decreasing the production of certain goods based on, the kind of feedback mechanism of prices and supply and demand. From their point of view, the market mechanism can very well do what consumption statistics cannot do. Now, Kielce in the chat there has said that cybernetics solves these problems. And I think with modern technology, you can solve this kind of market mechanism with, information systems that are well planned. So I think you can have a quote unquote communist system with, cybernetic functions, but where they're not using labor time planning, and you can have alternative forms of production today that they could not do then. But I think that kind of is missing the kind of key thing about the labor time measure. Kielce.
I was kind of trolling, actually.
Oh, damn it.
In fact, the more we read of this book, the more I wonder whether a lot of the stuff that I read on cybernetics, they sort of from the 70s and 80s and now could have worked, because it sort of, when it comes down to it, it's just a better form of statistical modeling, which isn't to say that there isn't a place for that, but you need and there's a lot of statistical modeling in capitalism as well. I'd say this most production these days is probably modeled on statistics rather than sort of market itself. But you have that feedback mechanism where everything else fails that tells you your model is broken with a market, and that's the thing I think that's needed, and that's why I'm really attracted to what's being proposed in this book, because it sort of gives you a feedback mechanism when all else fails, and I'm not sure cybernetics necessarily does promise provide that promise.
Yeah, and all the problems with you could have a cybernetic system with still having a central bureaucratic planners deciding on people's consumption standards and not the workers doing it themselves, and a lack of rationality between the price and the actual labor time in the good. So I think there's a whole series of other things that aren't solved by that type of approach. But yeah, good trolling. Appreciate it. Okay, so he goes on then to critique as well this wonderful capitalist market mechanism this last sentence here. For the proletariat, the whole splendid market mechanism moves only within narrow limits that capitalist profit production leaves to the commodity labor power. At the same time, there is no question of knowing the needs in the communist sense. So this is a major point. Like what would the market be for Lamborghinis in the morning, say, for example, or whatever the hell, that the market only tells you what the demand is given people's ability to consume. And under a system like capitalism, like there's probably large swathes of luxury goods that under communism would have no goddamn market at all. Like a Lamborghini probably, or, some of these crazy watches that are yachts. But no, I think we should have commie yachts. I'm well up for yachts. I like sailing, man. I would love to own a boat. But let's not say the yachts, but definitely super yachts. I'll go with super yachts. This whole a massive area of like this market that is like would just be completely destroyed under a different system. Any thoughts on this section about the market then, before I get cancelled for talking about how much I like yachts? Randy.
So this is also a little talking about the sentence right above when it's talking about capitalism works best and it is healthiest when real big profits are made. That is when workers are given as little as possible. I think I kind of want to talk about that too, like with this, because I think that a lot of the bourgeois economists would or might argue that capitalism works best and it's healthiest when enough of the needs of the workers are met that, there's not the potential for revolution and like there's not all of the potential there, right? So I guess what exactly is he saying by the healthiest? Because I think that that's pretty important as far as understanding the point that he's trying to make. Just like the best setup for growth.
Capitalism doesn't hit crisis when the profits are high. I think that's kind of his point. Capitalism in its heyday, when was it? Probably the 19th century or something, when profits were dead high and expansion was crazy big, and crazy big, yeah. Expansion was like, flying on full throttle. I think that's his kind of general point. But also, like if capitalism is really working well, like the workers will have jobs as well. I think that you see the revolutionary times more so when the workers are getting thrown out due to crisis. I think that's probably fair. I think Keelcha's hand up.
Kind of what he's saying there is capitalism works best just after a crisis, because that's when the workers are given as little as possible, and that's when you get the biggest profits for anyone who's coming back into the market.
You do have higher profits after a crisis, but you've just gone through the crisis as well. Any more points? Anybody have anything to say on this section here?
Could you consider the healthiest as like the post-World War II, where there's kind of that reset of the fixed capital, right?
Yeah, like I think it was probably one of the healthiest points. Probably, but it was pre-World War One. There was high profits then, I think. The Roaring 20s, not in Europe, that's for sure. In America, in the 20s, early 20s was probably pretty roaring too. But yeah, I think like for respect to like us, like in the last 100 years, you would say absolutely post World War II. Nothing capitalism likes best than a whole load of destruction. Okay, somebody else here. Who wants to read E, the abolition of the market in the Marxist sense? Chris.
E, the abolition of the market in the Marxist sense. So far, we have not made any further progress on the question of market abolition. We will, therefore, examine the Marxist view of the abolition of the market. The market is the place where the owners of the products meet to exchange their commodities. It is thus through the market that the transport of goods between companies is carried out and the distribution of consumer goods is carried out. This movement and distribution of goods must also take place under communism so that it is not a specific capitalist phenomenon. This cannot, therefore, be the abolition of the market. The market, however, does not only provide for the distribution of goods, but at the same time expresses the social conditions in which we live. It expresses the fact that the goods are privately owned. The market is also an expression of ownership. That is the essence of the market. Under communism, the market is simply abolished because Under the altered circumstances, no one can give anything except his labor, and because, on the other hand, nothing can pass to the ownership of individuals except individual means of consumption. This is the famous suspension of the market. The abolition of the market is, in the Marxist sense, nothing more than the result of the new legal relations. It says nothing about the organization of production or consumption, or how production is linked to needs. Bolshevism regards the abolition of the market as an organizational question. How can all operational units be united in one hand? With the abolition of the market, Marxism expresses only the changes in social relations, the change in ownership. As already mentioned, the movement of goods naturally remains under communism. However, the price of goods is not determined by supply and demand, but moves on the basis of their production time, in the association of free and equal producers. Therefore, the various operational organizations must interact with each other if they wish to receive goods. Since there is settlement between the operational units, it looks as if it is a matter of buying and selling, and thus the market still seems to be present. The same applies to the distribution of consumer goods. Consumers receive their products in their cooperative for consumption money and have complete freedom in the choice of goods. So here too, it seems as if they buy and sell, although it is not different than redeeming consumer vouchers for products. It can also be said that consumers have several vouchers with which they can collect the goods of their choice. The abolition of the market can, therefore, be understood to mean that it continues to exist under communism according to its external appearance. However, the social content of the movement of goods has changed fundamentally. The transmission of goods based on production time is an expression of the new social conditions. In fact, this is a transformation of concept, as we have seen previously in terms of value, income, and expenditure, etc. And just as language will preserve all these old names for the time being, it will also preserve the name market, because obviously the same principle prevails as that which regulates the exchange of commodities, as far as this is exchange of equal values. But content and form are changed.
This is Marx with his old content and form and essence. Okay, under capitalism, the market, the market is the place where the owners of products meet to exchange their commodities. It is thus through the market that the transport of goods between companies is carried out and the distribution of consumer goods is carried out. This movement and distribution of goods must also take place under communism, so that it's not a specific capitalist phenomenon. We had transfer and movement of goods between even hunter-gatherer societies, that some hunter-gatherers would have certain raw materials and there would be elements of trade on the edges of their society. So we wouldn't say that the hunter-gatherers had a market in any true sense, so the just transferring of goods is in itself not a market, because what they're trying to distill the actual essence of a capitalist market is here. Let's read it here. The market, however, does not only provide for the distribution of goods, but at the same time expresses the social conditions in which we live. Okay, what does he mean by that? It expresses the fact that goods are privately owned. We've got wage labor and the goods are privately owned. Labor power is a commodity. The market is also an expression of ownership. That is the essence of the market. So that when we meet in the market, I buy a car, I give you a certain amount of money or whatever, the ownership of that car is transferred to me. Now, only at the level of consumption would you say in communism would there be that kind of a different ownership relation? That be a person would own their consumption goods. But prior to that, all the way through society, transfer from raw materials into certain intermediary products to consumer products, and all the stages there is no transfer of ownership. It's like everybody owns that. So the actual content, the essence is very different, even if the form itself maintains an outward similarity to a capitalist market. Let me read this little quote here that I think. So this is from the Gotha program. Under communism, the market is simply abolished because under the altered circumstances, no one can give anything except his labor, and because, on the other hand, nothing can pass to the ownership of individuals except individual means of consumption. So there's no dude out there renting a house, and he's in the rental market, he's getting an income for not working. Yeah, there's nobody out there who's selling a drug who's able to put a patent on it, who can siphon off surplus from all over the place so that he can make an extra profit. In that sense, the market is entirely different. Kilcha.
I wonder to what degree implementing such a system would actually just sublimate some of the systems of hierarchy that money currently makes quite public. So say something like housing provision, for example, which you think would be allocated fairly, but it would be hard to tell if someone was, getting a nicer housing unit than someone else because of some favor and some back scratching done, and ditto across the whole society. In fact, it sort of starts to make me wonder if what you end up with is similar to sort of a giant commune where we in theory everything is non-hierarchical, but everything sort of works under the surface and is quite toxic as a result. And I'm not saying that I think that would happen. I just think it'd be interesting to explore the risk of that happening.
Oh, I think it's quite likely to happen, to be honest. I would say that, people will fight. I wouldn't say everybody cares about their rights to surplus, but I think certain people really would. And I think that would become an area whereby people can try and get a better deal. I think that's kind of inevitable. I think that's where a lot of the politics will kind of lie, but it would be entirely dampened down. I don't think you'll end up with somebody saying, well, I know the fella on the committee, so I got to live in Buckingham Palace, but they might be able to get like a better apartment with a better view. I don't doubt some of that will go on, and I think that's an ongoing battle for society to try and get away from systems of corruption like that. I think the battle, the kind of class war will shift to areas where it can be sustained, and I think that's where we're likely to see elements pop out. I think it would be highly dampened, though. This quote, this is the famous suspension of the market, going on the previous just quote from the Gotha critique of the Gotha program. The abolition of the market is, in the Marxist sense, nothing more than the result of the new legal relations. Yeah, so you don't change the market mechanism like this kind of idea of Proudhon with labor money or MMT. You don't say, the nexus, the key, most radical thing to do is to change money form. It's no, you change the production basis, the legal relations upon production. And then we see the higher, the kind of second order effects, like the change in the market based off those kind of core underlying fundamental principles. Okay, I think we'll try F. Who read that last one there? Randy.
F. The orientation of production to the needs. However, the economist Bloch is not satisfied with such an explanation of the abolition of the market, because it does not solve the problem he is actually talking about. He wants to know what will replace the market mechanism, what is the measure of needs under communism, that is, how the production apparatus will be adapted to needs. We answer that capitalism has no measure of needs, and therefore we don't have to replace anything at all. Communism can only achieve this by linking the distribution organizations directly to the production so that the needs become the direct guideline of production. Thanks to the threefold sacrosanct market mechanism with which supposedly adapted production to needs, the proletariat, when it takes power, is burdened with a production apparatus which unproductively squanders at least half of the labor power. At the same time, it is not set up according to the needs of millions, but according to purchasing power. Of the workers who are involved in the production of consumer goods, a greater part will produce those articles which serve the consumption of the capitalist, landowners and their retinue, state officials, church people, etc. Only a small part will produce those articles which are intended for the consumption of the income of the working class. With the change in the social relationship between worker and capitalist, With the revolutionary transformation of the capitalist relations of production, this would change immediately. If the working class is at the helm, if it has the power to produce for itself, it will very quickly and without much effort raise capital, to speak with the vulgar economists, to the level of its own needs. The adjustment of production to the needs, therefore, involves a complete transformation of the production apparatus. The factories that work exclusively for the luxury needs of the bourgeois are coming to a standstill or must be directed to the needs of the workers as quickly as possible. How quickly such a transformation can take place, we have seen during the war and in the following years in all countries. First, the whole production apparatus was adjusted to the production of war material, only to be transformed again after 1918 for the production of peace. By the way, it should be noted that capitalism itself switched off its famous market mechanism when it set up production for its needs, the needs of war. The organizational transformation into a communist economy can be carried out quickly despite the enormous difficulties whereby the needs for clothing, food, and housing are the guiding principles for the transformation. The food and drink industry is being transformed in such a way that the products that were previously produced exclusively for the bourgeois are no longer being made because the focus will be the satisfaction of the needs of the proletariat. Housing construction is a burning issue for the working class. A large part of production must, therefore, be directed towards the production of materials for housing construction. In short, the whole production undergoes a thorough transformation to meet the new demands. The first stage of communist production will, therefore, be characterized by the strong growth of some industries and the shrinking of others. It is a transformation process that will certainly not be without problems and inconveniences. It must, therefore, also be emphasized that this construction cannot simply take place in an uncontrolled manner, but that it must be carried out systematically. In this respect, the various efforts that have been and are being made to this end in Russia undoubtedly provide valuable material. While it is true that the Russian economy is based on the profitability of state capital and not on the needs of its workers, it is only practical experience we have in this field, and we must make use of what we have.
So he makes this a funny comment about how when Bloch was asking about like what would replace the market mechanism, because what is the measure of needs under communism? The GIC say we answer that capitalism has no measure of needs, and therefore we don't have to replace anything at all. Communism can only achieve this by linking the distribution organizations directly to production so that needs become the direct guideline of production. So I think within, we hear this idea of socialism as a planned system. I think that it's a combination of both planning and this kind of autonomous, decentralized links between distribution and production centers. If the increase in demand for shoes goes up 1 year, during that year, we don't say that. I think any rational socialist system would allow this kind of, inverted commas, market connection, this like linking of the distribution and the production centers to manage what needs to be produced, and that the planning elements would be much more based upon like large scale plans of general directions of the apparatus. So I think there's a tension within the idea of socialist planning between this automatic market type mechanism and the large scale plans like let's reduce our CO2 2% this year, or let's reforest 40%, or let's have components in all our electronics, let's redesign them so that they can be fixed easily and not just thrown out. I think, there's lots of kind of high level kind of planning type mechanisms that are done at a higher up level than just saying we need to produce 1.3 million shoes this year, regardless of what happens to demand from consumption from society. So he talks a little bit then about what kind of priorities you would have in a post-revolution. So what should we prioritize? He makes a case here like that to change your production for super high-end luxury watches into some other type of, to use those machines for some other types of production that will be used by society. There's a whole swathe of stuff that might change. And he talks about how in war conditions, this is precisely what the bourgeoisie did. I think in America between was it 1939 and 1945? I think it might even been longer than that. There was no cars built. every single car factory got reconditioned towards, I think, mainly building tanks. Randy had a comment.
I was just pointing out the similarity to, the coronavirus responses with, shifting factories to making masks and the like. Like, it's just a very recent example of this.
Absolutely. And in World War II, it was an incredible scale that Americans did it. They literally flicked a switch and they just changed production systems all over the place. I think the Germans in World War One, like Lenin and a lot of the people were extremely impressed by what the Germans did in a short space of time. Must have been probably one of the first cases maybe of it being done to such a scale. So then he talks about the difficulties, like about what type of things you should prioritize. It's interesting because I was reading a book there on 1919, the revolutions in Europe in 1919 and the conditions post-World War One. And it's like some of the conditions were really, like the lack of food was really incredible. I think in Vienna, older people were volunteering to commit suicide so there'd be enough food for the young people. So when things get really, really rough, the main priorities will be in a post-revolutionary period is food, water, shelter, clothes. This is the stuff, heating, that absolutely would be the first needs that would need to be met. I could imagine things being the kind of luxury production could take many years to get going if it was we're talking a post-Civil War situation. Or anybody else have any comments here on this section? Randy.
So I think maybe something that could be interesting to talk about is bringing in something that this book didn't really talk about at all, which is just like, climate change and trying to change our energy infrastructure and stuff. Because I think that the food and drink industry is being transformed in such a way that its products were previously produced exclusively for the bourgeois. I think that I'm in the wine industry and there's a lot of like more, natural wines or biodynamic wines, like kind of stuff that's trying to also strengthen the ecosystem of the vineyard and whatnot. Its market is largely for more like the bourgeois and whatnot, largely just because, with the economics of that, it's much more expensive to produce it and whatnot. But I just think it's interesting to think about how we would address things like industrialized agriculture being more efficient to, produce the food that we need for the population, like while still prioritizing being sustainable in our consumption.
Yeah, I think there's a massive need for more labor intensive forms of agriculture that are sustainable, like permaculture type ones where you can't just mow in with a big tractor. There are some kind of more market-based approaches and permaculture, there's a kind of a movement for regenerative agriculture and stuff like that. But most of them kind of seem to survive on basically selling high-end stuff to reasonably well-off middle-class people.
For sure.
But I think just like the wines, it's a lifestyle choice buying yourself an organic wine. So I think that, but I do feel like, yeah, there's a massive, literally a wartime level need to restructure the productive units of capitalism to deal with climate change. Now, will capitalism do it for climate change? I don't know. But a communist society would undoubtedly have that task to do. Randy.
Yeah. So I was thinking, do you think that maybe if we were thinking about this with respect to that, then perhaps, the organizational transformation into a communist economy can be carried out quickly despite, I guess when you're talking about the guiding principles, you would just kind of add a caveat that we need to focus on like providing these things in a sustainable way over, long periods of times, as opposed to more of a wartime economy where you're just trying to make it work for the task. Or I guess it is like that for the task, but the task being, shifting our energy infrastructure or whatever.
Yeah, I can imagine it would be an initial, a change of energy infrastructure, like planet-wide, would take a big, massive, probably kind of once-off amount of work to be done, and then to maintain that way of life, that change of life from then on, is more just like, depreciating capital and replacing of capital kind of a thing. But it would be the equivalent of a wartime thing. If we're being honest about a communist society, I think it's undoubtedly the case that a war is going to be involved somewhere along the lines that would be highly, highly destructive. So you're probably looking at both being necessary in our, if it was to happen in the next 20 years. Yeah, here's wishing. Let's go. Final section, G, the cooperatives and the benchmark of needs. Who wants to take this? Let's see. Kielce, do you fancy rounding out the evening with the all-star Kielce? How do you think?
Sure. The cooperatives and the benchmarks of needs. The needs are therefore the driving force and the guideline of communist production. Or, as we can also say, production is geared to demand. But not the demand in the wild, as capitalism knows it. We must not lose sight of the fact that production and distribution are by no means independent of each other, but that they determine each other. That is why the union of free and equal producers also requires the union of free and equal consumers. Just as production is carried out collectively by the operational organizations, distribution is carried out collectively by all kinds of cooperatives. In these cooperatives, the individual wishes of the consumers are expressed jointly. And because under communism the middlemen disappear and the cooperatives are directly linked to the operational units, the needs, as they are expressed in the cooperatives, are directly transferred to production. Undoubtedly, since the current production system is so badly adapted to needs, it will certainly not be possible to satisfy needs in the first days of communism. Now, the operational units are not supposed to expand production on their own authority in order to be able to react quickly to incoming orders because they cannot go beyond the general framework established in the general production plan. They can move freely, but within the plan. Otherwise, other sectors will run into difficulties, so that a targeted conversion is not possible. This link between the production apparatus and needs is an issue that can only be resolved by the flow of life, with the production plan as the guide for the producer's own initiative and activity. Just as the liberation of the workers can only be the work of the workers themselves, it is also self-evident that the organizational connection between production and needs can only be the work of the producer-consumer.
Okay, so this is going to this section, this kind of bit I was talking about earlier. Let me read this here, because now the operational units are not supposed to expand production on their own authority in order to be able to react quickly to incoming orders, because they cannot go beyond the general framework established in the general production plan. They can move freely, but within the plan. Otherwise, other sectors will run into difficulties, so that a targeted conversion is not possible. I think that there is, certainly with more kind of with IT systems, and I think the use of things like buffer stocks, I think that a lot of this stuff can be allowed. For example, it's pretty common in capitalism for buffer stocks to be kept. So say, for example, in the US, they have like an oil reserve, a kind of a national oil reserve, where they have 500 million barrels or 1 billion barrels of oil that they store, and they use that to allow, if there is an increase in demand, they will release some, or they will fill it back up, and when command goes down, that this ability to have essentially these buffers can allow people to work within the plan, extend outside of the planning things. And when we have all this general accounting, we can see what the consumption levels are going. It should be pretty easy to know if things are going towards dangerous levels, whereby we actually say, no, you cannot, even though you cannot produce any more up to this amount. I think Will put his hand up.
Yeah, so the U.S. definitely has the strategic oil reserves, but that's mostly for a military function. I think, with just-in-time manufacturing and distribution, we've actually seen that a lot of the buffer stocks that used to exist in warehouses and stuff have been increasingly made as small as possible, right? Because the less you keep in inventory, the faster you can kind of turn over your product. You can circulate through production cycles more quickly and make more profit, right? So I think, and COVID has shown some issues with that approach, with all these shocks and, problems with the supply line. So I'm not sure that it's ready-made for us to kind of just pick up. We definitely have the technical know-how to do it, but I don't know if the physical plant is. I think the physical plant has been progressively eroded in recent times.
you're just saying, like, under capitalism now, the idea, this use of, like, the reduction in circulating capital.
Yeah, the buffer stocks. Yeah, that there's fewer and fewer and smaller buffer stocks within the capitalist system. The government separately allocates, the strategic reserves, but that's for like war, so they can, fight.
Yeah, and also it was the oil shocks that I think it was introduced for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it was a lever of power that they just switched off on the Saudis. They're just like, oh, you want to cut production? Let's say you cut off production for a year then. So, I definitely under capitalism, like that whole thing coming from Japan of just-in-time production, like was all designed about having less stock. You need a smaller capital outlay and thus a higher rate of profit. But I do think that the ability for us to have computer technology to tell us what is the increase in, say if the shoe companies wanted to increase their leather by an extra 10%, what would the effect be, and how would that cascade down through the society, through other parts? Do we have the ability to go higher at this time? I think, will this cause a knock-on effect in, some other like leather, jacket production or something? So I think that there is the ability for these systems to allow for more leeway now than in the past. Kilcha.
It's an oddly detailed section. It seems to me like he can be quite high level in a lot of the book, and I don't see the need to go into such detail here because there are other obvious solutions as well. I mean, if you just have an order book, for example, then you can quickly tell who for the next year or 2 years has been allocated production from different units, and then you can redefine your decisions on production based on those bases as you see a increased order for the next year coming in and stuff like that. And we do that sort of thing in capitalism as well. I don't see why they couldn't do that in this system.
Maybe it's to do with the amount of complexity to look at all of these things outside of the plan in real time when you don't have IT. Perhaps I don't know. That's my instinct on it. Yeah. So a final sentence here of the chapter today is: just as the liberation of the workers can only be the work of the workers themselves, it is also self-evident that the organizational connection between the production and needs can only be the work of the producer-consumer. Yeah, I think that's nicely put. So have anybody got any comments then before we wrap up for today? Okay. So next week we are on to chapter 13, which is... So we're getting on to accumulation, a short one. On this episode, you heard the theme tune, The Order of the Pharaonic Jesters, and Night of the Purple Moon by Sun Ra and his orchestra. Thank you for listening, and please join me for the next episode of From Alpha to Omega. This show is a member of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast and research collective. Make sure to check out our network sister podcasts, General Intellect Unit, Jumpsuit Utopia, Mortal Science, and Swampside Chats. And if you'd like to help out the show, please remember to head over to Patreon and throw me a few commie dollar.